So what is the cloud? I'm going to give you a very quick overview as to what the cloud is. High level, we have private cloud and we have public cloud. Public cloud are things like AWS, and that is basically infrastructure that you don't own. Whenever you use something like iTunes or Dropbox, that's the public cloud. You don't get to see the infrastructure, you don't know really where the data centers are, kind of, and it's generally out of sight, out of mind. It's off somewhere else. Private cloud, on the other end of the spectrum, that's hardware that you physically own yourself or you lease off from somebody else, and that particular cloud instance is dedicated to you and your organization, so nobody else, you're not sharing it with anybody else. In between those, we've got hybrid cloud, and this is the model that a lot of modern companies are now starting to use, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So looking at public cloud, we've got three different levels of public cloud that people usually buy. And the way I like to think of this is you standing at your computer in your office. Now, if you're standing at your computer, the IaaS or IaaS stands for infrastructure as a service, and that's the equivalent of your PC. So it's effectively the box, and if you buy IaaS, you're effectively buying a CPU, some hard disk space, and some RAM. So you can then pretty much do whatever you want with that. You can install your own operating system. You can do pretty much anything you want with that. You've then got PaaS at the next level. So again, if you're standing in front of your computer, that's the equivalent of you sitting down at your computer, turning it on, and then you've got your operating system. So this is Windows, Linux, iOS. It's basically a company delivering a platform to you, an operating system. So again, there's some flexibility with it. You can install your own software, you can muck around with things, but in terms of the actual platform itself, it's set. So you have less control. And then you've got SaaS, which stands for software as a service, and these are basically software on the internet. So this is where you're getting things like Salesforce, if anybody's familiar with that, Office 365. You can't change the software itself. You can change some of the settings within it, but the software is the software. And pretty much from the bottom to the top depends on how much control you have. So with IaaS, you can do loads of things with it. With SaaS, you're buying a product and somebody else is managing it. There are advantages and disadvantages of both, and we'll have a look at those in a moment. So infrastructure as a service, this is good if you want to host your own applications, virtual machines, network and storage. It's usually unmanaged, which means that you've got to have somebody technical within your business to look after it, and you're going to have to update the operating system, the applications yourself. Platform as a service, this is a drop and go or application invisible infrastructure type setup. And again, like I said, you can effectively drop applications into this platform. They will install and load. Less control and more restrictive than IaaS. But again, you have a bit more flexibility with it. Again, you probably want to have someone fairly technical within your business if you want to run a PaaS. And then software as a service, this is what a lot of businesses now are going towards. So companies used to host their email in-house. A lot of them are now moving into Office 365. It's very convenient because you don't have to look after an Exchange server anymore. You don't have to worry about running out of hard disk space. You don't have to worry about all these other factors that you had to worry about when you were running an Exchange server years ago. You just buy the software license off Microsoft and you're good to go. It's very limited in terms of how much you can customize it, and you don't have any control over the infrastructure. So if the data center that the SaaS is hosted in is having a problem, then you're having a problem as well. That's true of lots of platforms, but it's very much more so with SaaS. I think Office 365 has suffered quite a few outages recently. So again, if that goes down, then everybody on that particular SaaS platform is going to go down as well. So then public versus private versus cloud. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of these? So a public cloud, your resources are owned by the cloud provider. So AWS, Azure, Google, these are all examples of companies that own the infrastructure themselves. You don't have any real control over how those data centers are run. You don't get to go and look and inspect them. And the companies, to a certain degree, can just move data centers and do whatever they want with them. Private clouds, you have a lot more control over it. Like I said, that particular infrastructure is exclusive to you, and they're usually stored in a data center, or they can actually be stored inside your office as well. Private clouds are quite advanced, and you usually, if you don't have the technical knowledge in-house, you want to be using a consultancy, or you want to be talking to a data center provider or a managed service provider to help you set that up. Private in-house PaaS and SaaS, so you can basically build your own private PaaS or SaaS platforms. Really large companies tend to do that. If you want to, you can have your own Azure public cloud, but in a private cloud environment if you want. It costs a huge amount of money. It's quite difficult to get set up in the first place, but if you want to know where your data is physically being stored, and if you want to have more control over it, then hosting a public cloud infrastructure, but in a private cloud stack, is a good way to go. And then hybrid. So this is the direction a lot of companies are going in. They are looking at what kind of services they're running, and they're picking the best platform depending on the security needs versus scalability and things like that. So private cloud, it allows for responsive capacity when needed. So that way, basically, if you've got a company that's doing lots of processing, you can use the public cloud side of things. But if you've got some smaller, more well-known IT infrastructure needs, then you can run that on your private cloud. So you get that balance of being able to scale quickly on the stuff that needs to scale quickly, and also have stability and known costs on the stuff that you need to run on a regular basis, but you know it's not going to scale fast. It's good if you want high levels of security, but you also want to have flexible performance, and David wrote some examples here, clustered SQL databases and rendering, or if you need to scale front-end capacity quickly, such as an e-commerce store. So this is an example of what's happening with a lot of enterprise customers. When AWS came out in Azure, there was this big rush to kind of like jump in there, and lots of companies said, we want to have a cloud policy, we want to put everything to the cloud, we want to get rid of all of our infrastructure, CapEx is dead, OpEx, is much better. But over the last 2 or 3 years, companies have slowly started to realize that actually it's not as easy just to say, I want to go into the cloud. There are some applications and operating systems that don't play well in the public cloud. So a lot of them now, 85%, are actually going for what's called a multi-cloud solution. So that's where they're using multiple vendors, or they're using multiple cloud instances, or they're using a mixture of private cloud and public cloud. So yeah. So good reasons to move into the cloud. So if, as an organization, you've got applications, if the demands on those have increased, but it's proving difficult to scale, so e-commerce websites, for example, are a good example, then you may want to consider moving that particular application into the cloud. If you need to reduce your CapEx costs, so if you've got really old hardware sitting in your office and you need to do a hardware refresh because it's basically starting to break down, then you may want to consider moving into the cloud. It is worth saying that despite what AWS and Azure say, the long-term costs of going into the cloud can sometimes be more expensive. It's not as clear-cut as you will save money by going into the cloud. If your company isn't growing very, very quickly, if you've got, and accountancies and law firms are very good examples of this, where you've got a fairly set number of employees, you know what your IT infrastructure capacity is going to be in 5-10 years' time. If you buy sensibly, then actually you can save money over probably 5 to 7 years by going down a CapEx, buying your own hardware type of a route. So it's not always cheaper to go into the cloud. That said, and I know there are some people who help with cloud migrations, sometimes it can be a lot cheaper to go into the cloud as well. So you have to talk to your provider. Another good reason is if you need DR for your system. So some companies, when they're starting to look at their risk register, which again has become very popular in the last 5 years, some companies have risk register officers. Certainly since the implementation of GDPR, people have become a lot more concerned about what happens if their entire IT infrastructure goes down. If you've got £50,000 worth of hardware sitting inside your office, but you want to have what's called high availability failover, which is where if that entire stack dies, then you can spin up another stack somewhere else and your company can carry on running. You may not want to spend another £50,000. That CapEx cost can be very high. So again, working with some consultancies, you can get your entire infrastructure set up on the cloud not have it spun up, but have it there ready and waiting so that if you do have a complete outage of your physical hardware, then you've got a DR solution sitting in the background, sitting in the cloud. Day-to-day infrastructure is getting difficult to manage. So again, if you've got really old legacy hardware, if you're doing lots of swap outs of hard disks because they're dying, or you're doing lots of patching because cables are getting old as well, lots of software maintenance, then perhaps moving into the cloud could be a good option. Or if you're already using applications that are already sitting in the cloud. And again, Exchange is a great example of that. Lots of companies were managing their own Office email by having an Exchange server inside their office. Microsoft created Office 365. If there's a cloud version of it and you've got a fast enough internet connection, then it's always better to just move over to the SaaS version of that. There are some risks associated with moving into the cloud. There's a lot of IT managers in companies will say, well, why mess with it? You know, if it's working, don't touch it. I'm a bit worried about actually moving stuff into the cloud. If you have a setup that works, don't move it. If it's inside your office at the moment and you're worried about security, so you're worried about potentially people going in and out of the comms room where your servers are sitting, you're worried about flood risk, or if you're worried about that data being, that hardware either being stolen or burning down in a fire, one second way is actually to move the kit into a data center. And I said I wouldn't mention it much. This is the one plug for co-location. Co-location is where you take your servers that are sitting inside your office and you literally lift them up, you bring them to a data center like ours, you put them into the rack, and that's it. We look after the infrastructure side, the security, the cooling, the fast internet connection, all of that stuff, but it's still your hardware. So it's not as expensive as putting it into the cloud, but at the same time, you have all of the security and infrastructure benefits that you would get from the cloud, but with still your hardware. So again, if your MD or FD is pushing your IT manager to go into the cloud, but there's a lot of resistance from the IT manager to do that because he's worried about the complexity of the migration, putting it into co-location could be a good other option. Data protection and security. Some sensitive data you may not want to put into the public cloud. Public cloud is not infallible, and there are certain SaaS systems that have been hacked over the last few years. So if you've got very, very sensitive data, I would not recommend putting that into the public cloud. Some proprietary technologies or applications just won't work. So if you work in an industry like logistics, I've spoken to loads of people who've got specialized software that was built just for them. You have to test that before you put it into the cloud. Quite a lot of the old legacy applications just won't work. Your applications may require lots of modifications, it's kind of the same thing. And additional latency. So some operations and applications may suffer or fail entirely due to poor bandwidth. So that's going back to the original point of, if you are going to put your applications into the cloud, you do need to make sure you've got a very fast internet connection. And noisy neighbors. You can't control who else is sharing your resources. So if you're using a SaaS product that's not Salesforce or Office 365, although actually with both of those, they have had experiences or situations where so Salesforce, I think, is a good example where they've had somebody thrashing their instance of Salesforce, and within that data center, within that stack that they're sitting in, it's had a knock-on effect on everybody else. So again, you can't control who your neighbors are in the public cloud. You just have to be a little bit careful about that. And platform or vendor lock-in. So you need to be very careful about which provider you're choosing, and ask them what the exit plan is. One of the trends that we're now starting to see with the hyperscale cloud providers, so that's really Microsoft Azure and AWS, is that they're pushing people towards a solution which is very difficult for them to then back out of. Now that's fine. If you're happy to go into that into that world, then that's okay. But you do have to realise that if you want to back out of it, it can be very, very difficult. What applications can I move? So some things to consider if you want to move legacy apps into the cloud. Complexity. Traditional applications can be very complex, so it may be difficult to move in. You need to look very carefully at the application to see whether or not it'll actually work in it. Integrations as well. If your applications play with other applications or work with other applications, then you need to make sure that they actually will connect once they've been migrated into the public cloud. Operating systems, again, if you're running servers with old legacy operating systems, they may not work inside the public cloud. Windows 2000 doesn't work very well in the public cloud. You shouldn't be running Windows 2000 anyway, and I'll talk about that in the final slide deck. but you may need a substitute operating system if you do want to move into the public cloud. Same thing with the databases. I'm not going to go through all of that, but like I said, you can have a look at the slide deck later. So, and there's also the network consideration. If you're moving all of your stuff into the public cloud, you have lots of considerations, such as you're going to have to change the IP addresses. You will probably want to migrate using DNS and domains rather than hard-coded IP addresses on your servers and your applications. Because again, every time that you move, you're going to have to then rechange those hard-coded IP addresses. This is getting quite technical, so again, I'll leave this in here for people to have a look at if you want to download the slide deck later on. And then lastly, if you want to migrate, it's really important that you start small and you test. So always go for proof of concept. Some of the things you want to look at are the performance comparisons, how hard was it difficult to actually migrate, what the network and IP issues are going to be, what the reliability improvements are going to be by moving into the cloud, and what kind of support you're going to get. All of these things are considerations. If your company hasn't already got somebody in-house who's very technical, you want to be talking to a consultancy or another provider who does know and should be asking all of these questions.